Hello, welcome to our study of British literature. Today I'm going to introduce you to literature and how it has developed from a classical literature into the modern, postmodern age. So we're going to look at the history of literature. Before we start that, we need to define what literature really is. And so we have to go back to see what the classical definition of literature is. First of all, I want you to realize that literature is made to be enjoyed, that sometimes we overanalyze literature. And so in my opinion, it helps you to enjoy it more. But some people are strayed away from that because they want to understand the literature as an escape from reality. I think the more we look at literature, the deeper we get into reality. So I would like for you to first of all consider what you would call a definition of literature. For me, I'm very classical, and so I believe that literature is an enduring form. It has history to it. It has survived. And so we're going to see some of the major works of literature that have been selected by others as being enduring works. The other thing that we need to see is what is our definition of classical literature. And so we have to have some criteria for that, some standards for that. And so what we want to do is develop an idea of what would make a literary work endure. In some ways, a literature work would endure if it has quality, and that is it's written well, it speaks to people's experiences, generation after generation. And so we're probably from different generations, but that's okay, because I've been through them all. So classical literature is a way to see relationship, a relevancy to our experiences. And the more universal they are to everyone's experience, I think the more powerful the literature. Well, then we need to understand, how did this all begin, especially in Britain? They had a sense of culture, and that's another definition for literature. Especially classical literature is a reflection of our culture. And so we see that sometimes these are specific literary forms that create specific ethnicity of a culture, backgrounds of the culture, and some of the problems and struggles and issues that culture is going through. That still lasts today in your own culture, except we have what we call a multicultural. And so we have a more complicated way of trying to unpack the reflection that we achieve from literature. So as we begin with the British, we have to see that Britain wasn't organized yet. It was colonized and created by Anglo Saxons, by Vikings, by others that were coming into that area. And so those cultural infusions create a sort of reflection of each literary genre that we'll look at, historical period. For the Anglo Saxons, of course, we have to emphasize the warrior mentality because they were survivors. They had to battle other tribes. And we see this with the invasions of the Saxons, the French, all these different ways that the people are trying to establish a nationality in their own country. And so with them, they bring different languages. And in fact, your English is part of the Anglo-Saxon linguistic system. And so we can thank the English for that. But there are other influences that come in. The Norman invasion of England creates more French influence. We'll look at that as we go through literature. Then we'll move into Middle English. And in Middle English, in the Middle Ages, we have the warrior taking a turn, and this turn is called the knight. And so the knight was supposed to be a man of honor, a man of chivalry. And so as we go through this period of Middle English, we're going to see a kind of purity that's developing, especially with the influence of religious values. The whole system changes to a religious idea of expressing their spiritual beliefs through literature. On the other hand, we also have an attack upon the church, and we see this very subtly in works by Chaucer, who writes the Canterbury Tales. Well, we move on then to 16th century literature, and here we have what we call Renaissance humanism. Renaissance humanism is a way of developing a new transition in which we had a development of a rebirth of learning. And so this rebirth sparks people intellectually and makes them want to write more in literature and develop more ideas about what it means to be a human being. The difference is that they are now starting to use not just a religious explanation for their existence, but other ways of explaining humanity. We also move into the Reformation during the 16th century. And here we see the establishment of the monarchy. We see the kings and the queens being developed, the two doors. That's not a card, it's a two-door, but they're called two doors. And we see this whole idea of the Elizabethans after Queen Elizabeth. And she becomes the model for the ultimate pure queen. And so we see that century developing monarchy. The whole idea of politics starts becoming infused with religion and with literature. Then in the 17th century, we see this struggle between church and state being developed and rift more with Anglicanism, the official religious church of England, the offshoots of that, of people that do not agree with a state religion, Puritans, who become our ancestors in our American puritanical religion. The Jacobeans are developed. The metaphysical poets are expressing spiritual ideas, but they're doing it starting with human beings, starting with a new kind of way of looking at the Renaissance, the rebirth of the human being that can use his or her reasoning to get to a spiritual level. And so we see the Carolinian era of kings, the revolutionary era that happens during this time, and we wind up the 17th century with the great poet John Milton, who reinterprets the Bible as literature. And so there's a combination of these things coming together. Literature is exalting. Literature is a way of exalting not just the humanity of the person, but the spirit of the person. The Restoration period follows, and here the Church of England tries to restore itself as the leadership of England. And so there's a much more totalitarian rule in England with King George. Well, of course, that colonial rule in America is going to create America itself. And so you have the development of our founders in America that were caused, in a sense, by this British Restoration. And so there's a new literature forming in America. And all of this is in the revolutionary spirit And so the 18th century becomes the Enlightenment period, in which our founding fathers, our political fathers, our literary fathers are searching for new innovative forms for literature in a revolutionary way. The Romanticism of the 19th century, then, is a response to that Enlightenment reasoning. And so we have the Romantics, the poets, the literary critics, and I think one of my favorite group are the Romantics, because they really foreshadow many of the more current values and systems in literature today. And so they start becoming more creative. They start looking at their emotions. They start looking at innovation of literature, different forms of literature, different ways of styling literature. But more so, they're more involved with getting outside themselves sometimes. They develop a transcendentalism, which means they want to go beyond just the natural world into, again, the supernatural world. But they do it through nature. And so they emphasize nature, and their individuality comes through nature. And it leads them to a greater nature, a sort of spiritual nature beyond that. And so by the time we get to the Victorian Age with Queen Victoria, we see this rise then of a new value system. The more mankind has become more reasonable, the more mankind has become more scientific. And so we have the rise of science in the 19th century that develops into the Victorian centuries. The science becomes an exaltation of science itself, of materialism itself, of technology itself. And so you have the founders of scientism, this idolization of science, chief of which is, of course, you'll recognize Charles Darwin in his theory of evolution. And so all this change is taking place. And so it attacks the foundations, the traditions of classical values. And so we have values of religion being challenged by biblical higher criticism. We have secular risings taking place in the 19th century. The great scholar Karl Marx believes that we can answer everything deterministically through economics, through materialism. And then we have the return of people that want to go back to fantasy, want to go back to the good old days of the Middle Ages. And so they revive the King Arthur legends, the mythology of the Greeks, the mythology of the Anglo Saxons. They have all these different ideas. And so, there's this tension between realism and materialism, and there's a tension between idealism, this whole idea of spirituality, romanticism. And that becomes sort of the pendulum swing of literature. Depends on where the authors stand. Do they want to exalt material realism, or do they want to exalt idealism and spirituality? Well, that leads us up to where we are today, because we've been influenced by the 20th century. I believe that it takes about a century to influence a generation. And so you're part of the generation of the 21st century, but we call you the postmodern century. That is, you're after the modern century. In the modern century, they try to develop, again, this innovation, this kind of creativity, especially in art and in literature. And so they're exalting all of these new innovations in literature and art, but along comes the world wars. And that really puts people in a perspective of negativism. They're trying to overcome the death that they see. They're trying to overcome these values that they had cherished in their civilization and culture. They have become what they call nothingness. And so they have been deconstructed. And so this is why most literary writers during the 20th and 21st century are developing a symbolic approach to literature, because there's no truth anymore. There's no absolutes anymore. Everything is relative, and I'm absolutely sure about that. And so they are trying to develop this whole idea that diversity is all you can hope for. Individuality is all you can hope for. And the only way to do that is to find your creativity. And that leads them to postmodernism. Postmodernism emphasizes the absurdity of human life, the absurdity of existence itself, the death of God, no supernaturalism. There's an alienation between people. There's a relativism emphasis. And all of this amounts to nothing. It's only your response that can do you any creative good. And so they simply say, enjoy life, find innovation, find creativity, and create your own literature. In fact, the whole conclusion to this is to not read the text, because the text will disappear. It's nothing. But to read the text and to have a reader response to it, so that you can write your ideas in the margin of the text. And as you're writing your ideas, then you're developing your literature. And so this is where we have wound up at this point in our lives, in the history of literature. And so studying any type of literature, whether it's British literature, American literature, world literature, it's a way of really examining ourselves. And so the best way is to read between the lines, find meaning, find that theme. And I hope that you will also, as you're doing this, not become so over-analytical that you can still find a further enjoyment through the study of literature. Thank you.